Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Every Thought Captive event. Are the Christian scriptures reliable? Can we believe the Bible in our contemporary age? We're so glad you were all able to be with us tonight, and I really do hope it's going to be an instructive and enlightening evening for everyone. And let me again, right up front, say thank you again to the Cliff House and to them for their hospitality this evening. If you see some of their employees, thank them for all that they've done for us tonight. Our goal tonight is to create an open and thoughtful environment where some important issues can be discussed. For all kinds of reasons, we're not always able to accomplish that in our world today. So it is important to us that this is a place where we can listen and interact. My name is Phil Steiger, and I'm the pastor of Living Hope Church. We're just west of Bijou and I-25. We're hosting this night because we believe it is important to provide these kinds of opportunities for our community and to have a chance to talk about our faith in a reasonable and in a thoughtful way. In fact, that is our larger goal, to present the Christian faith as reasonable, as winsome, and as true. So even if you disagree with some of what is presented, I hope this night gives you some useful things to think about. When this is over, we don't want you to walk away empty-handed. We have a website that's populated with materials that dovetail with our theme tonight and other important topics. And you're always invited to interact with us there. It is everythoughtcaptive.org. We have some handouts also that you should have received on your way in, including outlines for the presentation this evening. You also received a postcard, and we would love for you to fill that out and return it to the registration desk on your way out. Any contact information that you provide for us there will only be used to inform you of other future events. In addition to that, Living Hope Church is hosting 2 follow-up events on the Sunday nights of April 12th and 19th, both at 6 p.m., and I'll be talking about why this issue of reliability matters so much. Everyone is invited, and there's more information on the flyer that you received. So that's a little bit about me. It's a little bit about us. So now a little bit about our topic and speaker. Almost every Easter season, the Bible becomes big news. Articles, book releases, and documentaries all address issues at the center of the historical Christian faith. Some of them trace the history and doctrine, but many of them are produced from a critic's point of view. This time of year, it is common to see the position put forward that the Christian faith is based on unreliable documents or history. And because of what Easter celebrates, the specific issue often is the resurrection of Christ. But the bigger picture is made clear by these criticisms. Are the Christian scriptures reliable documents? Can we trust the history contained in them? And then can we trust the claims made by Scripture that Christians have based their faith on for 2,000 years now? The Bible is an open book and is thus the subject of study and scrutiny both from within the church and outside her walls. And as a result of popular works of fiction like the Da Vinci Code and the proliferation of books by the so-called new atheists, to more in-depth works by authors like Bart Ehrman, it has become popular to simply believe that the Bible is unbelievable. But our guest, Dr. Blomberg, addresses these contemporary issues in his latest book, Can We Still Believe the Bible? And says about the advances in scholarship that there are, quote, areas of scholarship where new findings, or at least much more intense study of slightly older discoveries, have actually strengthened the case for the reliability or trustworthiness of the Scriptures, even while the most publicized opinions in each have claimed that there are now reasons for greater skepticism. So in other words, it may be popular to believe one thing about the Bible, but the best evidence points in the other direction. We are privileged to have Dr. Craig Blomberg as our speaker this evening. He is the Distinguished Professor of New Testament at Denver Seminary. Dr. Blomberg completed his PhD in New Testament, specializing in the parables and the writings of Luke Acts at Aberdeen University in Scotland. In addition to writing numerous articles in professional journals, multi-author works in dictionaries or encyclopedias, he has authored or edited 20 books, including The Historical Reliability of the Gospels, Interpreting the Parables. He's written commentaries on Matthew, 1 Corinthians, and James, Jesus and the Gospels, an Introduction and Survey, Christians in an Age of Wealth, a Biblical Theology of Stewardship, as well as many others, and the work that I cited, Can We Still Believe the Bible? An Evangelical Engagement with Contemporary Questions, which addresses our topic tonight. A brief note on the format this evening. Dr. Blomberg will present, and then we will open the floor for a guided question and answer. We want to be fair to everyone who might want to ask a question, so it would be good that you are as clear as you can be and actually posed a question or an issue for him to speak to. If we are still engaged at 7:30, I will officially end the evening, but you are welcome to stay and continue the discussion. So without further delay, let us welcome Dr. Craig Blomberg.
Thanks. Wow, I don't need to give an introduction. That was great. Thank you, Phil. What a beautiful spot. I had visions of coming in late and having to make all kinds of apologies. I made it to downtown Manitou Springs by 5:30 and then had no idea where to go. Tried several things that seemed to fit what MapQuest was trying to tell me, and then God wanted me here because all of a sudden I saw this little sign that said Washington Street, and that was on my instructions, and it didn't look like it went to anywhere, but I followed it. And here we are. Yes, it's Easter, and more specifically, today is what Christians for centuries have called Good Friday. So I teased Pastor Phil that this is the most unusual Good Friday service I have ever been invited to be a part of. But I'm grateful for the invitation. I'm grateful for everyone who came for whatever reason. And the more I thought about this assignment, the more I thought it makes sense to do it sometime on Easter weekend. Not only for all the reasons that Phil just gave you, but even more so, before there was a resurrection, there had to be a death. And if you look at attendance in churches, Easter competes with Christmas Eve, but usually beats it in terms of the greatest outpouring of folks. And Good Friday gets a token nod by the real faithful and committed. And yet, it is, Christians believe, the death of Jesus as an innocent God-man that made possible our salvation, our redemption, and his claims were then vindicated by the events of Easter Sunday. If you're not deeply familiar with the Bible, you probably would have no clue what to say, because some of my first-year seminary students have no clue what to say when I suggest that a good exercise might be in a fairly detailed paragraph to summarize the storyline of those 66 books. Well, you should never ask somebody to do what you wouldn't do yourself, so on your handout is one attempt, unrevised, printed for you the way it first came out for me. God creates the universe and humanity. Human free choice to rebel leads to humans alienated, estranged from God. God initiates a plan to bring us humans back to himself through a man named Abraham and his descendants, who become the people of Israel. He rescues them from slavery in Egypt in the time of Moses, gives them laws to follow in response, and promises a fertile land for them to live in with peace and prosperity, as long as they have a decent measure of commitment to him and obedience to his law. After 40 years of wandering in the Sinai wilderness, they conquer part of this promised land under Joshua. After Joshua's death, Israel is led first by judges and then kings 3 of them over a united kingdom and a whole passel for a few centuries under a divided kingdom. The north also called Israel and the south called Judah. But disobedience, idolatry, rebellion against God frequently leads to the surrounding nations attacking Israel and even taking many of their people into exile, especially when the northern kingdom is taken off to Assyria, and then later the southern kingdom to Babylon. But under the Persian Empire, they are restored to the land and are promised a deliverer, a Messiah, who will rid the land once and for all of all foreign powers. 400 plus years go by, hopes get up but are dashed. And a man by the name of Jesus, a Jew from the northern part of Israel in the small town of Nazareth, as a young adult shows many signs of being that Messiah, but declares that spiritual liberation is more important than physical liberation. He works miracles, he fulfills prophecies, he teaches wisely, he loves the unlovely, but he challenges the religious power brokers of his day, and as a result his movement seems to be distinguished when he is executed, crucified, nailed to a cross on a Friday in AD 30, which is what Christians commemorate today. Nevertheless, his followers claim to see him alive again the following Sunday. They begin to spread his message, even worshiping him as God. And within one generation have established small house churches in most major parts of the Roman Empire. These followers increasingly distinguish themselves from all existing religious options, though they emerge out of Judaism, are increasingly persecuted, particularly by the Roman leaders for doing so, and they, like we, await what has come to be called Jesus' second coming, a return to earth to right all the world's wrongs, to vindicate his followers, to vanquish his enemies, and usher in a recreated heavens and earth. It's an amazing plot. There's no other world religion that tells the story in narrative form in its sacred scriptures, occupying more than a minute percentage of those scriptures of what they believe God to be doing, that encompasses from before time began to after time will end. Some religions don't even have a small part of their scriptures that contain that comprehensive a story. And certainly no others claim to have that as the overarching storyline of their entire scriptures. But can we believe it? Well, what does that question mean? I'm glad we have until 7:30, but I always make promises I don't keep, as my students who I regularly let out late can tell you. Somewhere between 7 and 7:10, how's that for some wiggle room? I'm going to stop talking and hope that you have enough questions that we can go up to 7:30 and have to be kicked out at that point. And yet we will only scratch the surface of a handful of issues. And you're welcome to ask other ones as long as they're somehow on the topic. If you ask about the Broncos next fall, I don't know. I won't try to be an expert on anything I'm not. Sometimes when people say, can we believe the story, what they mean is, do we even know what people originally claimed back then? Has the text been copied carefully enough in all those centuries of handwritten manuscripts before the invention of the printing press? And then what about translating the Hebrew and Aramaic of the Old Testament and the Greek of the New Testament? And there are chapters in here that deal with that, but I'm not interested in tackling that tonight. For some people, can we still believe the Bible means, what do I think of its theology? What do I think of its claims about God and the state of humanity in relationship to God? That's a great question, but churches talk about that most every week. Some people, can I still believe the Bible, think immediately about ethical questions. What God's Word says is Christian responsibility, how to behave in various walks of life. I suppose in our 21st century Western world, issues of human sexuality dominate all other ethical questions. And I'm not going to talk about that tonight. Have I left anything? Yeah, lots. If the Bible, unlike any other sacred scripture, is predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly narrative, predominantly story, allegedly history, can we believe that the major contours of what the Bible says happened really did? That's the question that, as Pastor Phil and I talked about some options, we landed on. Did these things happen? The things that are recorded, in scrolls that looked like that. Well, at least for the New Testament, and this is one of the clearest facsimiles of a 4th century manuscript with a text you all know very well. Pater, hagiastheto to onomasu. Father, hallowed be your name. Elthato, he basiliasu. Your kingdom come. Gain, hey. You got to see where the words break, because there weren't any spaces originally. Telthelimasu. And now I'm up to here. Hos en urano hutos kai epiges. Oh, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Any Greek speakers here? Nobody ethnically Greek? Rats. I could have made up anything. But that's out of Luke chapter 11. I want to proceed backwards. I've always been a little bit of a rebel. Not because I'm trying to be silly, just a few days after April Fools, but because if you're asking a historical question, the farther back in history you go, it doesn't matter what the topic is, whether you're studying Homer, whether you're studying the Han Dynasty in China, whether you're studying some Native Americans that lived in cliff dwellings somewhere nearby. The further back you go, with rare exceptions, the less evidence there is. Less documents there are, the less archaeological digs are left to be uncovered. And oh my goodness, have I been involved in conversations over the years and even classes that have started with Genesis and never gotten out of the first chapter. So I want to start with undeniable historical fact. There is a Christian church. It's worldwide. And there are documentary records, some of the oldest being copies of portions of the Gospels. This is a tiny fraction of a complete New Testament, but we have small fragments of portions of sentences that go back to the early 2nd century, and if you've been following leaks on the internet, good reason to believe that maybe by the end of 2015 some publications will show that we even have some scraps that have been discovered of late 1st century documents. The jury is still out. We know that those Christian churches didn't simply emerge in a vacuum, one day sprouting up out of nothing. Their beliefs are deeply embedded in Judaism. A Judaism that was forced to change dramatically after its capital and holy city, Jerusalem, was razed to the ground by the Romans in AD 70. We know that the Christian church was in existence as basically a Jewish sect prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And crunch the numbers of the epistles, the letters of the Apostle Paul, and you have him becoming a Christian and being enfolded into existing Christian churches within 2 to 3 years of Jesus' death, 32 to 33 AD. There is historical evidence that takes us back at the very least to within a couple of years of the death of Jesus of Nazareth. What accounts for the rise of this church? Every source in existence says it had a lot to do with this guy named Jesus. But if you were just writing as a secular historian, and some people have made this case, you might say the person who really, literally put Christianity on the map, there's the map, was a man named Saul of Tarsus, who took his Latin name Paul after he began to preach about his newfound faith in Jesus in non-Jewish territory, especially in what we would call Turkey today and Greece, and eventually, briefly, in Rome. This is one of his so-called 4 missionary journeys, and some of the names you won't recognize unless you've studied ancient history, and a few of them I hope everybody recognizes. If you look up there and say, I don't even know what the Mediterranean Sea is, remedial geography might be worthwhile. A book called The Acts of the Apostles contains dozens of names of people and places all around this swath of geography and slightly beyond its boundaries that appear in other Jewish, Greek, Roman sources of the day. Some of them appear on inscriptions. Some of them appear in literary documents. Well, maybe the first Christians, some would say, wrote what we would today call historical fiction. Maybe. Except as far as we know, that literary genre hadn't yet been invented. The closest you got was someone taking certain genuine people and events and fictitiously expounding on them, but doing so with some fairly blatant, obvious inaccuracies. Like having somebody on the throne of Rome who was a Babylonian emperor from centuries earlier as a tip-off that this is fiction. Or coming right out and saying it even more directly. But this isn't what we find in the New Testament. I like to show slides. I could have come here and done nothing but show slides. And some of you might not have been impressed. Some of you may not be impressed anyway. That's okay. I doubt any of you will be the worst critics I've ever faced. You look nicer than they do. Oops, that didn't do anything. The book of Acts and the letters of Paul putting together most of what we know about the first 30 or so years of Christian history have so much archaeology and corroboration and inscriptional evidence that you can literally sign up for anywhere from a week to 6 months tour with different organizations just traveling in the footsteps of the people who are described. There are Roman roads leading out of Tarsus, Saul's hometown. Pavement is a little worn, but will ours be in that good condition after 2,000 years? There are ruins of synagogues like this one in Pisidian Antioch, where the book of Acts says Paul preached. There are inscriptions that I can't read from this angle. This one has Lystra in the third line. It's in Latin, and Lystra happens to be spelled the same way in Latin as in English, so not like one student who once asked me why it was in English. A relatively out-of-the-way town in what we would call central Turkey that archaeologists didn't even think existed until the early 20th century when they discovered this. The pillars of the gates to the central agora or marketplace of Philippi. One of the letters that Paul writes is to the Philippian Christians. Athens, if you ever have a chance to go there, with the amazing Acropolis, with the amazing ruins of aqueducts, and somewhat smaller in comparison, a big rock known as Mars Hill, or the Areopagus, once the site of the town council meetings. Kind of awkward, so later they moved it to chambers along the Stoa, reconstructed in the 1930s. The walkways where Paul discoursed with Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. A wall that disclosed ruins of a ceremonial throne or judgment seat in central Corinth, where a man by the name of Gallio oversaw a brief hearing when Paul was arraigned. Gallio, we know from an inscription discovered elsewhere, ruled in Corinth only for 1 year, from 51 to 52. And that enables us to date, going backwards, a lot of the events that happen in Acts and the epistles. Some more Greek inscriptions. The last 4 letters in capital letters of the Greek synagoge and the first 3 letters of the word Hebraion, a synagogue of the Hebrews in Corinth. Nobody believed there were Jews there. Then they discovered it. Complete with menorahs, the 7-branched candelabras carved into the pillars. Complete with the Latin paving stone that translates roughly, Erastus the Aedile laid this street at his own expense. A name that appears in the greetings at the end of the book of Romans, written from Corinth. It's in an open-air museum. If you want to be rude, you can actually go stand on it. And then you'll get in trouble. Real people. And these are just almost randomly chosen examples of major and minor characters. The library, the facade, reinforced but not reconstructed, of a pagan philosopher by the name of Celsus in Ephesus. Amazing place to visit if you can ever go to the ruins of Ephesus. And Paul spent 3 years there and wrote a significant letter that's found in the New Testament there. And they tried to bring him to the theater where people were rioting. But his followers snuck him out and the town clerk quieted things down. Original stones for the most part. But go backwards still. What about Jesus? What about the Judaism out of which Jesus grew? What about that story of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70? The Western Wall, I'm sure you've seen pictures of this if you haven't been there. The so-called Wailing Wall outside the temple precincts that Rome left standing as a kind of in-your-face reminder to the Jews of who destroyed all the rest, who was in charge. And the largest stones that are now on ground level go back to the 1st century or slightly before, at the time of King Herod. Real places. If you're a young boy getting a bar mitzvah today, there's nothing more special than to get to do it here, complete with dances with the Torah scroll, the law of God. We read about the Pharisees, the Jewish leaders, sitting on Moses' seat, an honorific name for the place from which the local rabbi in a synagogue preached. He got to sit while the audience stood. Aren't you glad that it's the other way around today? This one dug up in Chorazin in Galilee. And a look at a portion of the walled-in old city of Jerusalem, the sort of triangular section sprinkled with trees, has unearthed just a treasure trove of 1st century roads and ritual baths and the foundations of shops and the remnants of stairways where Jesus and other pilgrims coming to Jerusalem would have walked. But what about all the details that you can't corroborate? What about Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount, including the Lord's Prayer? There's no archaeology short of the remarkable discovery of somebody who was inscribing it into stone in the 1st century, bits and pieces of Jesus' teaching, that's going to corroborate that. And if you study some of the dates, even the most conservative dates that Christian scholars give for the writing of the Gospels, they are a generation after the life of Christ. The 60s, 30 years and a bit after his death. Shoot, we're not even sure we get the news right the day after. But theirs was an oral culture. No internet. Not even old-fashioned newspapers. A town herald at times. But an educational system primarily for boys, and also in the Greco-Roman world, that emphasized astonishing feats of memory. Jewish schoolboys studying a certain portion of the Torah had to memorize it first before they could discuss it. Otherwise, you might accidentally get it wrong. Boy, would I love to reinstate that in some churches today. It ain't going to happen. The Gospel of Luke gives us a remarkable opening paragraph that's the most detailed account of what one of the Gospel writers himself thought he was doing. Many, he begins, have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Luke himself was not one of Jesus' 12 apostles. Neither was Mark. Matthew and John were. Luke gets his information secondhand. But he interviews eyewitnesses. He carefully investigates everything from the beginning. He writes an orderly account for a patron, a man by the name of Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. And this kind of language as a preface to a narrative is what you find in other Jewish and Greek and Roman histories, not in their novels or works of fiction. Doesn't prove Luke performed flawlessly, but it at least shows you the kind of literary genre that he believed he was writing. I have way too much in the notes, but maybe they'll whet your appetite for even more in some of the books in the bibliography on the back of the page 2. Whether you get any of mine or not is irrelevant. There are more embarrassing, awkward details scattered about the historical parts of the Bible, including the Gospels, than you find in any other scriptures of other religions. In fact, if you read the Old Testament, it feels like about 3/4 of the time Israel's in rebellion. And their own people recorded it. That's not normally what religions do. You cover up the awkward and embarrassing stuff. Jesus said he didn't know the day or the hour of his own return. Why would you preserve that? Unless you felt compelled by the fact that he said it to do so. One time he said those who don't hate their parents or children are not worthy of his kingdom. And another parallel account, it says those who love God less than me. Okay, well, it's not an emotional hate then. But we're not too far from focus on the family in this building. That's not one of their popular texts. And understandably so. Awkward. Why include it unless you're compelled by the evidence. Entire books about the growing archaeology impinging on Scripture continue to mount with every passing year. Go online and you can see all kinds of claims that are not based on evidence, that Jesus never existed. It's one popular website that has about a dozen names of individuals and says, why would these first century Greek and Roman historians say not a word about Jesus if he existed? It's worth taking the time to Google the names. Not one of them is a historian. A couple are philosophers, a couple are playwrights, one's a botanist, another's a geographer. And most of them are early first century, far away from Israel, probably never even heard of Jesus yet because the message hadn't gotten there. So how relevant is that list? There's another popular website the skeptics like to show 10 pre-Christian religious or philosophical figures with dramatic parallels to events from the life of Jesus. So misleading. You look them up and the one thing they get right is that all 10 figures were pre-Christian. Half of what is said about those is just made up, not based on any ancient claim. And where there are genuine parallels to the life of Christ, they all came in post-Christian legends ascribed back to those original people. The website doesn't bother to tell you that. Internet's great if you know how to use it carefully. There are about a dozen Jewish, Greek, and Roman sources. I list the names. Second to last line on the bottom of page 1, if you put the composite of all their testimony together about Jesus, you get the following. He existed as a early first century Jew who was born out of wedlock, whose ministry intersected with that of a man named John who baptized people, who had a brother named James, who as a young adult gathered disciples, 5 of them are named, who regularly made very provocative and countercultural interpretations of the Jewish law that got him accused of being a blasphemer, a sorcerer that led Israel astray in part because of his wondrous deeds. An elliptical reference to the miracles, perhaps, and exorcisms. And he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, which narrows the time frame to 26 to 36 AD. And yet, despite his death, his followers continued to believe he was the Messiah, resurrected from the dead. They began to gather in groups to worship him, singing hymns to him as if he were a god. And his following has not died out to this day. Interspersing my summary with snippets of exact quotes. You say, well, that's not a whole lot. True. Nobody had a clue in the first century that Jesus had just founded what would come to be the largest religion on the planet. And in those days, history and biography was almost exclusively written about kings and generals and military people and the rich and philosophers and people in officially sanctioned positions of religious leadership. Not about average people, and not about some self-styled upstart rabbi that disagreed with half the interpretations of the law that were current. What exists is about what we should expect to find. And lots of little quotations and references and allusions to things Jesus did and said scattered about the letters of the New Testament written already in the 40s and 50s, even if the Gospels weren't written down till the 60s. By ancient standards, remarkably early. Lives of Alexander the Great, for example, still in existence, weren't penned until 500 years after his death. And yet classical scholars reconstruct a fair bit of what they have every reason to believe is trustworthy history from those sources. But what about if we start to work further backwards? There's a period in between the completion of what Christians call the Old Testament, the Jewish Scriptures, and the first century events and writings in the New Testament. If you're interested in that, you can read at your leisure, even while I'm talking, because this is the era of multitasking. Some of you are catching up with your email at the same time. You do it because I see you do it in church. I mean, others do it in church. Shame. Qumran, the home of the spectacular discovery just after World War II in the late 1940s, continuing into the 50s, of the so-called Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, I think I can start to understand how pottery jars containing scrolls hidden in the backs of caves whose mouths opened to sheer cliffs in every direction might have stayed hidden for a while. And was a little shepherd boy, Arab shepherd boy, who was throwing rocks into the mouth of the cave and always hearing thuds, and all of a sudden once he heard a plink. And somehow, like a mountain goat, he found a way to scramble down there, and that began this amazing discovery. I think I have a second slide. One of which was the major Isaiah scroll, nearly complete copy of what we now call 66 chapters of Isaiah in Hebrew. The next oldest copy was almost 1,000 years later. And the differences were just minuscule and trivial in copying. They weren't all preserved that well. But some spectacular discoveries, as well as documents written by this monastic sect known as the Essenes, that give us greater insight into the diversity of Judaism at the time Christianity was born. What about the latest period of time that the Old Testament treats? This seal discovered mid-20th century. The name of Baruch, written in Old Hebrew, Jeremiah's scribe, is one of numerous characters from the latest books chronologically of the Old Testament, like Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, and Chronicles, and others. Sanballat. Even Christians who recognize that name deserve gold stars. The governor of the territory just outside Jerusalem who opposed Nehemiah when he came back to rebuild the walls. Persian, Greek rulers whose names appear in the Bible, corroborated from other sources. Go backwards still. Hezekiah's tunnel. You can walk through it. It's a favorite thing for tourists to do. There's almost always a little water, so you want preferably shorts and shoes you don't mind throwing out afterwards. And the light that you see there is not natural light. You have to have a headlamp or a flashlight, otherwise it's pitch black. It's about 1 kilometer long, about 0.6 of a mile. Hezekiah, one of the significant kings of Judah in the time of the prophets, in the time of the divided monarchy. How many names do you recognize if you're a Christian? Jehoram, Omri, Hezekiah, Jehu, Sennacherib, Nebuchadnezzar. You say, I'm glad you're pronouncing them. Go back further still. At the site known as Tel Dan. Tel is just a mound that gets excavated. In the north of Israel, where in the 1990s, not that long ago, the first ever inscription referring to the house of David, Beit David, was discovered. And that remains to this day as the oldest character in the Old Testament that we have conclusive inscriptional evidence from some source. Go back to the time of Solomon, when he builds the temple that David had in mind, because the people had said, we want a temple like all the other nations surrounding us. This is actually a mock-up of the temple in Herod's day. Nobody, to my knowledge, has done one for tourists to see on this kind of scale of Solomon's temple. But we have excavated other temple sites in the surrounding nations, and they match the biblical description of Solomon's temple. He really did build one like the nations. You say, well, why can't we excavate Herod's temple and then maybe under that Solomon's temple? Well, there's this pretty big, significant, ornate building called the Dome of the Rock, the third most holy mosque in all of Islam, that's in the way. And unless you wanted to start World War III, you don't try to take it out. Keep going backwards. Go back to the time of the conquest of Canaan, a portion of the ruins of Jericho here, where Joshua fit the battle. Old-fashioned past tense for fought from some children's song that was inflicted on me once. Joshua and Judges describe two generalized statements that are in some tension with each other. There are these sweeping statements about Israel conquering the land, but then when you read the fine print, Joshua says, however, these kings weren't taken and these cities weren't taken. If all you have is archaeology to base your evidence on, at about the time the scriptures say the Israelites inhabited the land, you have a sudden influx in about half of the sites excavated of garbage dumps, places for bones of animals that were eaten, without a single pig bone present. And in the other half, there are plenty of pig bones. And if anybody's saying, what does pig bones have to do with anything? Well, if you're a faithful Jew, you don't eat pig. And so you don't have pig bones to throw away. Interesting. Does that prove every detail in Joshua? No, of course not, but it's striking. The very fact that there is, between the 13th and 11th centuries BC, a sudden influx of new settlements in Israel, as well as the growth of others. Can't prove some of them weren't Chinese. Pick your favorite culture. Anastasi. How would they have gotten there? More likely it's the Hebrews. Keep going backwards, and we have Egyptian hieroglyphic paintings documenting the presence of foreign slaves helping with Egypt's massive construction projects, including the pyramid and the Sphinx, a number of whom escaped, all in one big group at some time. Does that have to be the Hebrews at the Exodus? No. It would be a very interesting coincidence, though, if it weren't. We keep going backwards, and there's not much to see other than semi-arid terrain with rocks cropping up everywhere, and unless you have a skilled eye, you won't be able to distinguish the rock that's there because it fell off the hill 500 years ago from the rock that's part of a wall, from part of a building that goes back to a couple of centuries BC. Have we found proof of Abraham or the patriarchs? Not a bit. Should we expect to when we start getting that far back? But the kind of circumstantial evidence that at least shows that the customs and culture described are true to life to that period, even down to details like the price of a slave, which did not remain fixed, even down to such customs like one that's suddenly come back into fashion after almost 4,000 years. The present that Isaac gave his wife Rebekah for her wedding, a nose ring. Better not object to nose rings. Going against the Bible. Of course, I suppose there's, what do you do with them? Before Abraham, we have what people describe as primeval history. History by definition that we don't have sources directly relevant to. And yet there are Semitic people groups surrounding ancient Israel. There is one document that has a foreign king saying, "I studied inscriptions from before the flood." Oh, I wish I knew what that was about. That's all we know. And what can be deduced from that? The king thought there had been a flood, and he studied inscriptions that he thought came from before the flood. And tantalizingly, every continent on the planet has yielded from more than 4 centuries ago deeply embedded traditions of some kind of a huge flood. What do we do with that? I don't know. We don't have any pictures. So I Googled Noah's Ark and clicked on images and picked one. And now you can see why I didn't start with creation. You want to start a debate, talk to people, including Christians, about creation. But I have a daughter who's a scientist and a strong believer. And she accepts the Big Bang Theory, and we're not talking about a TV show. And that's one thing you'll get if you Google Big Bang. And let's see, we do have some children here, but she said this when she was 8, coming home from Sunday school class. And we had to try not to laugh too hard because she was very serious about it. But I really haven't come up with a better way of saying it. She said, "Mommy, Daddy, we talked about creation and evolution in Sunday school." I go, "Oh boy." "Why? What did you learn?" "Well, I've got it all figured out." "Okay." "Tell us." "If there was a big bang, there had to be a big banger." "You're right, Rachel, you're right." And she's given me permission to retell that. I owe her a Starbucks every time I do, and since she lives in Philadelphia, every time I see her, I just buy her a $100 Starbucks card for the number of times I've told the story. None of this proves even a majority of the historical details in the Bible. We wouldn't expect it to be able to. We can't prove a majority of the historical details in narratives about any ancient person, and we have far more evidence for Jesus than any other person from that time or earlier. But it creates a climate favorable to belief. And from that point, an awful lot depends on whether our starting point is, when I read an account where it proves reliable, where it can be tested, I give it the benefit of the doubt where it can't. Or do I assume every ancient document, including ancient religious documents, must be suspect, and I'll only accept anything from it if there is rock solid evidence? If you take that second approach, quite frankly, you need to discard every world civilization textbook in existence or online, because most of what we read wouldn't pass muster with that skeptical approach. But somehow people think when it comes to Christianity, some people think that's the right approach. I would like to suggest I think it's backwards. I don't know how Dr. Groothuis ended his last talk, that some of you might have been there, but he likes to use this analogy. Some people talk about a leap of faith, as if the evidence really doesn't get you very far. And then, like that long jumper running down the track, you just have to hurl yourself as far as you can and hope you don't fall backwards when you land in the sand pit. Doug says, no, it's more like a step of faith. Well, in some places, maybe it's a bigger step than in other places. The evidence cannot prove the Bible. The evidence cannot prove Christianity. The evidence cannot prove any ancient figure or any religious option, but evidence can go a long way toward making a step of faith a reasonable, a credible, a realistic option. And not just because Doug and I share an office wall. He's on the one side of it, I'm on the other, next door to each other. But I think that's the way to put it. Especially on Good Friday, I commend that faith to you. I kept my promise. Just. It's 7:10. We've got 20 minutes. What do you want to talk about? Somehow tangibly related to can we believe the Bible? And I'm going to sit down since I'm not an ancient rabbi. But I thought they had a great idea. And I have a bad knee. Yeah, sir?
I'm glad you talked about how who was written about was people of some importance or
Yeah.
and so it has always kind of it occurred to me as I was looking at things like this that Jesus was somewhat obscure.
Absolutely.
And so it's interesting that what we have written about him are written about those who are most familiar with him.
Right.
And so motive often comes up. And we talk about, they had the motive to do this, they had the motive to write about this. Many of them gave their lives to follow him.
Right.
And so they had a commitment, gave their lives for it, whether they did that out of guilt or whatever, who knows.
Yeah.
So that motive and that close tie, protecting themselves, protecting what they believed, how does that, I lost my train of thought here, but how does that
play into all that we're talking about?
Does that compromise the reliability?
No, I don't think so. And in fact, I think you can push it one step further. Why even the 30-year gap? Well, Jesus talked a lot about ushering in the kingdom of God. Talked a lot about the end of the world, at least as we know it. He talked about returning to earth, coming on the clouds of heaven. And he said a number of things without ever setting any dates that certainly led some of his followers to think that perhaps that would occur within their lifetime. Well, if you think the world's going to end that quickly, you probably don't devote most of your time to historical research. 30 years down the road, in an age of, on average, much shorter lifespans, if you made it to adulthood, the average adult's lifespan in the ancient Roman Empire was somewhere in the 40s. People are starting to die off. Eyewitnesses to Jesus' life are starting to die off. Some of the second tier of apostles, associates, are starting to die off. Maybe we're going to be around with this movement we've signed up for a little bit longer. Maybe we should put pen to papyrus and preserve some things a little bit in writing. Could be one of the reasons. Excellent topic. Sir?
Talk about your definition of proof. I mean,
right
now, I would have to have blind faith to believe that Jesus did not exist as a person. And yet, we'll find some people in academia that make such outrageous claims.
I was a math major in a previous life. So I use it in the mathematical or scientific sense. Can I put together a series of statements like a geometric theorem, and at the end of the day say, therefore Christianity is true, therefore the Bible is entirely reliable, QED, quod erat demonstrarum, or something like that. What was to be demonstrated? No, I can't. Can I mount what I think is a very credible case? Yeah, I think I can. That's how I'm using proof.
Right. In the scientific sense, you can only prove things that are repeatable. History by nature.
That's right. Good point. I can't prove in that sense everything I read in the biography of Abraham Lincoln, no matter how meticulous the research was, and that's barely a little over 150 years ago. Good point.
Let's push the envelope even a little bit further. The kind of proof we're talking about here is the only proof that they left us with. And God in the Old Testament told us what he would do before he actually did it. Case in point, Dead Sea Scrolls, we have hard copies that predate Christ himself, Isaiah 53.
Yeah.
And Isaiah, the way he writes that some man is going to give sacrifice, he's writing against the Jewish mindset at the time that God spoke, I'm against those who gives human sacrifice. But yet Isaiah boldly went through that religious culture and gave the message that God would come and give himself as a sacrifice. And not only that, he would stay dead. And there's other little tiny details in that chapter.
Right.
That fulfilled in the crucifixion week.
Another whole topic. I'll come back if you want me to. Fulfillment of prophecy.
And yet he was writing 700 years at least before Christ walked on the earth.
Yeah,
There's no
absolutely.
way he could have figured that out on his own.
Good stuff. Yes, ma'am.
Is it assumed that from earliest history the scriptures we have from creation are passed on by oral tradition? How do we get scriptures in
The information that would eventually come to be written down, when we're talking about the historical portions, not a set of laws, not letters, not proverbs, but when we're talking about accounts of events, in oral cultures, all of the ancient Near East and Middle Eastern cultures were oral, would have been passed along primarily by word of mouth, but not exclusively. Go to a site in modern-day Syria by the name of Ebla, where as recently as the 1980s, an amazing cache of tablets from another culture, Semitic, partly Semitic culture nearby Israel, and you find some as small as handheld size, stone tablets inscribed with everything from a bill of sale and the price received for various items of goods to bits of royal chronicles. And these go back to between 2,000 and 3,000 BC. We have not yet discovered anything like that from really ancient Israel, from the first half of the Old Testament. Could something like that be discovered someday? It's certainly possible. And the fact that it was discovered for a nearby culture means it's very likely ancient Israelites did the same thing. But where those kinds of things have been discovered, they tend to have something to do with the royal court, regal families, people in positions of power. It's much less likely that the average Joe construction worker kept a diary and wrote something on tablets of stone. But certainly passed on traditions from child to grandchild. Communities would gather together, small villages for ceremonies, for festivals, for holy days, and credentialed leaders would retell the story of that community. We find that in Southern Europe, we find it in India, we find it in North Africa, we find it around the Middle East. That just seems to be a constant feature, and one that's rapidly dying out. And except for people that have preserved oral history, interviews transcribed with elderly people from the last 75 years or so, we may live to see a time when that practice has vanished on our planet, but it's one that was done for millennia. The more sacred, the more precious it was to an individual or a group or a community, the more careful you were to pass it on. Yeah? Great questions. Comments? Who wants to join in the fray, please?
So I've heard a lot of skepticism about
about Genesis.
Oh, sure. That's the oldest of all.
Exactly. Like, I guess, did Moses write Genesis? I'm not exactly sure who wrote it, but there's been questions put to me, well, how did he know that those first days that God created the earth before he created
Sure.
man? You know, how did he get that information?
At some point, and not just in Genesis, how did the disciples know what Jesus and Pilate said to each other behind locked doors just before the crucifixion? Well, I suppose there always was a servant attending, safeguarding the Roman governor, and one of those might have later become a follower of Jesus and passed the word on. But sooner or later, there are things that are narrated in Scripture where, for believers who say we believe these works are inspired, they are from God, we have to say, yeah, something like that had to be revealed, had to be supernaturally disclosed. No witnesses on any interpretation of Genesis 1 to 3. There were no witnesses there for creation. But if it is a holy book, by definition, that's one thing that religions ascribe to holy books, is divinely revealed. Yeah.
If I were a skeptic, I would say you've only presented half the story.
Oh, not even half.
Are there archaeological findings that would contradict the scripture? If you put the balance of what's that's supporting what's not, what's the percentage?
Yeah. Very, very few. And that's a good point. What do you do when somebody says you got an hour to talk about the whole Bible? Just barely scratched the surface. There are classic problems. We should be honest about it. As far as we can tell, Quirinius, governor of Syria, when Jesus was born, beginning of Luke 2, didn't begin to reign until AD 6. A little bit late. But I open my latest edition of the NIV and I go to that passage, and I see a footnote. Those of you that read the Bible, I hope you read the footnotes. I don't mean study notes. I mean footnotes that say things like verse 2, or this census took place before Quirinius was governor of Syria. That's a legitimate option for translating that passage. I happen to think it's the right one. I'm in a minority, but not a tiny minority. Well, what about Jericho? There's another classic one. Boy, we got layers on layers on layers, and we can trace what went on almost century by century at Jericho, and we just can't find signs of sudden total collapse at the right time to match Joshua fitting the Battle of Jericho.
I heard there were possibly two Jerichos.
Well, that deals with a New Testament issue of harmonization. That's not related to Joshua. Okay, let's be honest. We haven't found it yet. Here's another Groothuisian statement. Is that how you'd make an adjective out of Doug Groothuis's name? The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. I do not know my genealogy before somewhere in the early 1700s. All the records stop. Even the Mormons haven't been able to find anything. And they do a good job at that. Does that mean that one of my ancestors at that point was virgin born? Or maybe born of no human parents? No, the absence, we just don't have it anymore. And so when you're talking about something that is 12 to 1400 BC, depending on how you date things, because that mound has been worked over and worked over and worked over, it may have nothing more to yield, and whatever evidence may have been there may have crumbled 2 millennia ago. That's a little different than saying there's an absolute contradiction. Oh, well, then there's that place in the book of Acts where Gamaliel is speaking on the Sanhedrin, coming to the defense of the apostles. And in Acts 5:35, he says, "Men of Israel, consider carefully what you intend to do to these men. Some time ago, Theudas appeared, claiming to be somebody, and about 400 men rallied to him. He was killed. All his followers were dispersed. It all came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean appeared in the days of the census and led a band of people in revolt. He too was killed, and all his followers were scattered." Well, we have information about Judas the Galilean in some detail from a Jewish historian by the name of Josephus, and that also took place around AD 6. We have evidence from Josephus of a guy by the name of Theudas who led a revolt in the 40s after Gamaliel was speaking. Hadn't even happened yet. Did Luke make a blatant error? Well, gee, what are the odds that there were more than one Theudas that led a... Who names their kid Theudas? That's such... I don't care who names their kid Theudas today. The question is, was it a common name back then? Yes, extremely common. Especially when you realize that it's a contraction of Thaddeus, and it also has several ways to form diminutives. In fact, Josephus refers to about 15 different people named Theudas in the 1st century alone. Okay, he only mentions one that led a rebellion. Could there have been a second? I don't know that we can immediately rule that out and say, oh, well, the only Theudas it could possibly be referring to is this one, and that's a blatant contradiction. So, yeah, there are other issues. What's the proportion? Minuscule. Where there really are seemingly intractable problems compared to the amount of corroboration. Like maybe 5% to 95%. It's overwhelming. Yeah.
Is it appropriate to say that the Bible is inerrant?
As a historian, that goes beyond what we can say by the way of evidence. As a believer, if I think it came from God, and I think that God doesn't make errors, make mistakes, then sure. So it depends on which hat I'm wearing. If I'm wearing my Christian hat, I will say yes. If I'm wearing my historian's hat in a context where I'm not presupposing everybody has Christian faith, then I won't try to be quite so ambitious in what I claim. And it's 7:30, and I don't think a single person left. That may break some kind of record. I mean, I go to a church where they leave in the middle of the service just to go to the bathroom.
You know, I go to a church that does that as well.
Oh dear, I'm sorry.
I'm kidding. Hey, we thank Dr. Blomberg for his time tonight. Thank you again for being here this evening. And feel free, if you didn't pick up the information on the way in, there's still some on the way out. And have a blessed Easter weekend.